Albert Einstein famously said, God does not play dice with the universe, but what if we could use dice to talk to God? Welcome, Bruchim Abiyim. I'm Rabbi Paul, your virtual rabbi, and you have found Beit Virtuali. Now, the actual quote is, "Quantum theory yields much, but it hardly brings us close to the old one's secrets. I, in any case, am convinced that he does not play dice with the universe." Now, without pretending any expertise that I do not have, what he was talking about was, in the 1920s, the emergence of quantum mechanics and the reality that was slowly being discovered that quantum mechanics deals in terms of probabilities as opposed to definite answers. Einstein spent a great amount of his life looking for a TOE, a theory of everything, something that would bridge the gap between relativity and quantum mechanics. And part of that came from his theology. He wrote in a variety of other locations about his view of God as a cosmic force, specifically a cosmic force that imposes order on chaos. And I'm not going to argue theology with Einstein in this moment, except to say that there's something deeply spiritual about chance and randomness, which brings us to the question, can we use dice to talk with God? Now, if you've been following Beit Virtuali for any amount of time, or if you have ever been in any of my congregations, you know that this question alone sounds a little bit strange. It sounds like I'm talking about God as a person, which I'm most certainly not. So in order to get through the rest of this video and to even be able to have this conversation, we first have to accept what I'm saying. You don't have to agree with me if you don't want to, but accept that what I'm saying has nothing to do with God being anything like a person. And as a matter of fact, this only works if we accept the third principle of Maimonides, that God has no body nor anything that can be compared to a body. In other words, the second that we actually think of God in any way as a person, all that I'm going to be trying to talk about is going to fall apart. And I've got a lot of other videos that are talking about this in various other ways. But to get back to dice and God, or asking questions of the eternal and having dice reveal the answer, I don't really mean dice, but I mean something like them. In Judaism, we have the Urim and Thumin, and before I get too much into it, first of all, if you ask what are the Urim and Thumin, the answer is no one actually knows. We have an idea of what they are, and we're going to look at some of the texts that are going to explain or at least give pretty good clues as to what the Urim and Thummim are, but no one actually knows what they are. But we start with the question of God talking. Now, if I'm making the claim that God has no human-like features, then Vaidaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, God spoke to Moses, follows the Vaidaber, the speaking part of that has to be a metaphor for something else. And I've written and talked variously about that being a shorthand, a shortcut for when a prophet, someone who has that incredibly extraordinary relationship with truth of the universe, that they can close their eyes into a trance and sense things that we can't, they can break through barriers of consciousness and self-awareness and community awareness that we simply can't. And so Vaidaber Adonai el Moshe lemor is probably some sort of shorthand for Moses entered into a trance and these thoughts came to him. But that means that this entire idea of speaking is the best way that we can use biblical language to understand something that is not understandable. God does not have a mouth. God does not, therefore, speak in a voice. Therefore, when we're talking about communication with the divine, we're talking about other things. And believe it or not, and I don't know why this isn't discussed more often, because you talk about a way to get kids involved in religion, spirituality, and Judaism. This verse actually allows us to discuss what the Torah, what the Tanakh means, because there's an explicit verse in 1 Samuel that says exactly what Jewish tradition, biblical tradition, Torah tradition means when they say God spoke. And here we have this verse from 1 Samuel chapter 28, verse 6. And there's a little bit of context that is required here, because this is getting very much towards the end of Shaul HaMelech's reign, right? The first king of a unified Israel. Historically probably never happened. He was probably a very important tribal chieftain who might have ruled a confederation of several tribes in the south, but most probably was never, even more than David was, king over a unified kingdom. And there's a lot of humor and a lot of interesting stories that surround Saul. His qualifications, according to earlier in 1 Samuel, for being the king is that he was the tallest and best looking person around. The more that we think things change, the more they stay the same. Anyway, Saul is a tragic character because he was kind of innocently and unwittingly brought into the kingship, and he was a little bit crazy, or the job made him crazy, and he saw David as a rival, and a lot of the second half of 1 Samuel is him chasing David around trying to kill him. And just, if you've never read 1 Samuel, it is one of the most fascinating books, and I spend a lot of time talking about it in my new book. But we get to this part at the very end, and this is right before the very famous story of the witch of Endor, so a necromancer that Saul goes to in order to try to find out what to do. And the reason he's driven to this is because God won't speak to him anymore. Now, this gets especially interesting because Saul has been shown to be, if not a prophet, but very much like a prophet throughout the course of 1 Samuel. Again, if this is all sounding weird to you, read 1 Samuel. It is weird. But at some point, he has fallen so out of favor, and that's been quite explicit in the text, he's fallen so out of favor with the Eternal that the Eternal will not answer him in any way. And we get this extraordinary verse. Vayishal Shaul Adonai velo anahu Adonai, Gam b'chalmot, gam ba'urim, gam b'nvi'im. So Saul inquired of the Eternal, but the Eternal did not answer him either by dreams or by Urim or by the prophets. This is amazing. Every single time in the entire Tanakh that we have something God spoke, we know the meaning. We know what this is. We have this idea of God speaking with a human mouth, but the Tanakh is telling us, it's letting us know how the kosher sausage is made, that what the Tanakh is actually talking about is when we hear the voice of God, it is via a prophet speaking, it is via dreams, or it is through the use of the Urim and the Thumin. So, since Moses was a prophet, Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, God spoke to Moses as follows. Something in Moses' consciousness allowed that communication. That is for a different day. And as a matter of fact, if you become a member of Beit Virtuali, we've got 8 hours of classes on what the Tanakh is saying when it's referring to prophets and what that communication actually is. I'm not going to repeat it here. It's really worthwhile going through those classes. And then we've got dreams. Well, we are introduced to that all the way back to the dream of the Sulam, right? Jacob's ladder, the angels coming up and down. And if you actually want to know what that is, one of my favorite books I highly recommend, Lawrence Kushner's God Was in This Place and I Did Not Know It. 7 interpretations of what that verse means, but it's essentially God speaking through a dream. And then, of course, the master of the dreams, the story of the dreams in the Torah tradition is Joseph. But once again, we have to start with this rule. Dibra Torah k'lashon b'nei Adam. Torah speaks to us in human language. So again, Torah is a shorthand for describing more complicated sorts of things. And the easiest way to portray stories with a snap that make them memorable is to visualize an anthropomorphic God who speaks. And so this is used over and over again. And I don't even think the people who wrote and edited the Torah meant for us to take that literally. It was just the best that they could do to describe something that takes too many words to describe. But what they're talking about when they're talking about inquiring of the eternal or having the eternal speak, it's through these 3 different modalities, through the modality of the prophets, the modality of dream interpretation, and the modality of the Urim and Thumin. So before we get deeper into it, we should probably try to hit head on what are the Urim and Thummim. And I've said dice from the very beginning. Most academics, most scholars, and I include myself in this, see the Urim and Thummim as a type of what's called Claromancy. So this word mancy is very important. Mantia, it is added at the end of a prefix which tells us the type of divination that's being done. So mantia is referring to divination. So if we have ornamanti, this is divination through bird sign, right? If you've seen the series by Bruno Heller, Rome, you see the birds being released. And of course, you had the political leaders paying the right amount of money to have the right kind of birds released so that the right kind of sign would be read by the priests, right? We've got necromancy using the dead in order to divine answers. That's what the rest of the chapter 28 of 1 Samuel is about. And the fact that we have anything regarding divination whatsoever that is allowed in the Tanakh should blow us away a little bit, because when you reach into other parts of the Tanakh, if we reach into Torah especially, we will find that anything that is not already specifically allowed is considered a to'ava. It's an abomination. So what does the Torah actually say? Well, there are 2 particularly famous passages, one in Leviticus chapter 19 and 20, one in Deuteronomy chapter 18, that talk about all the things that are forbidden in an attempt to figure out what God is saying to us. And the text says, "So when you enter the land that the Eternal your God is giving you, you shall not learn to imitate the abhorrent practices of those nations. Lo tilemad la'asot keto'avot hagoyim hahem." Okay, so specifically we're going to get a list of things that are forbidden right now. Why are they forbidden? Because we have these 3 allowed things on how we are able to speak with the Eternal, or allowed groups. The text continuing, "Let no one be found among you who consigns his son or daughter to fire, So child sacrifice, or who is an augur, a soothsayer, a diviner, a sorcerer, one who casts spells, one who consults ghosts or familiar spirits, or one who inquires of the dead. Now, I deal with this right off the bat in my new book, because one of the problems with this passage is we read some of these words. Makshefa is in there, makshef, and that is usually translated as witch. Here it's sorcerer, and we think of Exodus, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, and all the women who were killed throughout time because of that. And the problem is we see a word like makshefa, and we think of our idea of what a witch is, especially from medieval times or from popular culture. That is not what's being spoken of 2,000, 600, 700, 800 years ago. What is being spoken of is anything that challenges the elite authority of the emerging Jewish leadership and consciousness in their ability to say, this is what God is saying to us. And if it sounds pretty political, then that's because we're not used to thinking of God in terms of a political presence among us, or we're not comfortable with that because we do it all the time, whether we like to or not. But the word before makshefa is nichash, and a nichash is someone who practices divination, like reading bird sign, or, and I've got somewhere in the bookshelf behind me, a book of all the 33 groups in the Babylonian Empire, for example, that spoke to their various gods through various divinations. And the reason that the Torah is saying that this is abhorrent is because this is what the surrounding people were doing, and we were trying to develop a different power structure. How do we know? Because it's explicit in the text. When you get to the end of this passage of what's forbidden, the Torah then says, those nations that you are about to dispossess do indeed resort to soothsayers and augurs. To you, however, the eternal your God has not assigned the like. Okay, we should be hearing at this point, what has been assigned to us? What are we allowed to do? If we're not allowed to do those things, then what are we supposed to do? Navi mikyebecha. So the eternal your God will raise up for you a prophet from among your own people, like myself. This is Moses who is speaking this passage. Him you shall heed. Of course, there were also 7 prophetesses. Quick, can you name them all? So you can look at this mystically, you can look at this politically, you can look at this polemically or practically. But speaking with the eternal was something that was reserved for certain people in society. And the most prominent or important, of course, in Torah, this makes sense because we've got Torah considered the 5 books of Moses, Moses being the greatest of all prophets in Jewish tradition. So this makes sense. But as we look through various texts, we see that there are other methods that are also kosher. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a Joseph story. Otherwise, we wouldn't have Jacob speaking to the eternal explicitly in the text in his dream, or at least the eternal communicating with him, as it were. And so we get to the Urim and the Thumin. What are they? And there's a few clues. We have this lovely passage from the book of Exodus, chapter 28, verse 30. And I love it because this is nearly romantic in how it's expressing the use of Urim and Thumin. Inside the breastpiece of decision, so the choshen that is worn by the priest, you shall place the Urim and Thumin. Think about opening up the ark to see the Torah scrolls in your shul, and many of them have a choshen on it, a breastplate. So the way that we dress up a Torah scroll is meant to honor or impersonate the way that a priest, a high priest, was dressed up. And so in the breastplate, you will oftentimes see a little box right at the bottom there, and sometimes there's even a sliding door, and that is a memory of the place, the slot where the Urim and Thummim, whatever they were kept. So inside the choshen, inside the breastpiece of decision, you shall place the Urim and Thummim. And notice the name of this in translation as well as in Hebrew. Choshen HaMishpat. What is a mishpat? Well, we oftentimes talk about chukim u'mishpatim, so laws and regulations, but a mishpat is a decision. Right? You've got a choice between A and B. The decision that you make is the mishpat. Look how it's being used. We've got the choshen of mishpat. We've got the breastpiece that has within it contained the ability to make a decision. And what's in that? All right, so inside the breastpiece of decision, you shall place the Urim and the Thummim, again, whatever they are, so that they are over Aaron's heart when he comes before the eternal. Thus, Aaron shall carry the instrument of decision for the Israelites over his heart before the eternal at all times. What an absolutely remarkable passage. Okay, there's several others, but let's look at the one that is considered by scholars to be the deciding point to help us understand what the Urim and Thummim probably were. This is going once again to 1 Samuel. I told you this is just a treasure chest of interesting stuff. We've got chapter 14, verse 41, and we read, Saul then said to the eternal, the God of Israel, show Thumin. Jonathan and Saul were indicated by lot, and the troops were cleared. All right, not too long ago, as for when I'm posting this video, we had lots cast, the Pur, holiday of Purim. So we have lots, which again is a form of Claromancy. You cast something in order to have a decision rendered. That's why I say dice, because if we don't know what they are, what are they? Now, there is another translation of this that's expanded. So the earliest Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures called the Septuagint. And sometimes we learn a little bit extra about the Hebrew text from the Septuagint. This verse is double the size in the Septuagint, and there are two possibilities. One is that it represents a slightly earlier tradition before some of the information was edited out in the final editing of the Hebrew scriptures. More likely, it was an expansion to help people who were not Jews understand, since this is a pretty opaque sort of idea if you're not used to what the Urim and Thumin are. And so in the Septuagint, the verse reads, "Why have you not responded to your servant?" Saul speaking, Saul being the servant of God. "If this iniquity was due to my son Jonathan or to me, O Lord, God of Israel, show Urim. And if you say it was due to the people of Israel, show Thumin." So when you back up and read this entire passage, this is a decision-making point where Saul is trying to figure out overall if he should be going down to fight the Philistines, who were the prototypical enemies of the Jewish people at the time of 1 Samuel. And in the process of this, a few verses earlier, Saul inquires of the Eternal using the Urim and the Thummim, and the Eternal doesn't answer. This is what makes this so fascinating, because how can you, if you're throwing the dice, for example, could God not answer? Especially if it looks like the answer is binary. Show Urim, show Thummim. So that would kind of indicate, instead of dice, maybe a flip of the coin. Heads, we attack the Philistines. Tails, we don't attack the Philistines. And then somehow an answer wasn't given. And so then it's heads, you didn't give an answer because I or my son Jonathan has done something wrong. Notice how Saul hedges his bets onto his son Jonathan, who is in love with David. Or tails, it's the rest of you people who just aren't doing your job. Now, I wouldn't have even had an idea of how to deal with this on a practical level had I not had my own experience with this. And I remember when it was, C.R. Anderson Middle School in the 8th grade, I had a nickel out. I was with two other people and we were office assistants for second period, and I flipped a nickel and it landed on its side. Can't imagine that would have happened with a dime, but this is real. And so can you imagine trying to ask a question of the Eternal and you've got some sort of binary divination device? Heads, I do this, tails, I do that, and you flip the coin that lands on its side. You might enter into a sort of discussion on what exactly is the Eternal trying to say to me. So in many ways, you can imagine this in any way you want. And the first thing that we have to get through is, why is this divination allowed? And the reason is probably because this predates the interactions that the Hebrew and the Jewish people had with the surrounding nations. This is probably something that came out of our tribal traditions. This was one of our methods of divination that came out of our tents before we started building cities. And so this one was kosher where others weren't necessarily kosher. This is something that was transferred through. So this type of divination, this also allowed, by the way, the priests to maintain a certain type of power that would have been reserved to the prophets, right? If only the prophets can say what the will of God is, and you can imagine that only prophets would also be the dream interpreters. So if you only have prophets that can say the word of God, and you've got another group that's looking for power and influence in society, the priests, then you can imagine the priests wanting to hold on to their ability to ask a question of the Eternal. And if this had been something that had been hundreds of years old at this point, you can imagine both being there. Now, what would happen if the prophets and the priests clashed? Well, that's not clear in the text on which one won over, but we get to the original question. Can we actually talk with the divine? Can we have divine communication through the flip of a coin, the rolling of the dice? Well, this is the part of the video where I repeat myself what I said earlier, and that is, if once again we think of God as an extreme form of a human, some version of a bearded dude on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel who sees if we're naughty or nice and zaps us if we haven't been very good, then we're going to have a real difficult problem with this. What we're talking about is communication with our higher selves, with the unknown, with that which is greater than us. It's what we try to do when we just are bereft. It's what we try to do when we have no answers. It's what we do when we know something's wrong and we can't figure out what's going wrong. Communication with the eternal at an individual level is attempting to get past this moment where we're stuck into a moment where we can move forward. Communication with the eternal at a community level is how do we understand what our place in the world is, and how do we get past this disaster of the moment or this challenge of this moment. And so if you look back at that original verse that I quoted from chapter 28 of 1 Samuel, that the Eternal would not answer Shaul either by the prophets, by the Urim, or via dreams, then we actually see all the modalities where we as individuals and we as members of a community might try to find those unanswerable answers. The prophet, again, I'm not going to go hugely into prophecy, but essentially a prophet was a person who saw clearly. Now, I think most of us would like to think that we're people that see clearly, but let me give an analogy that's going to offend at least 75% of the people that's watching this. We are so caught up in our tribalism and our political parties right now, for example, that it doesn't matter what country you're living in, it doesn't matter what party you belong to. If you have a leader in your country who is a member of the opposite party, they can do nothing right. Okay, it's actually not possible that a leader, know how bad they are, can never do anything right. And so if we believe they can't do anything right, we're not seeing clearly. We're seeing through the eyes of our ideology. And it doesn't matter what party it is, because we saw that a few years ago in the United States, and we're seeing it in a different way now, depending on who we're talking about. That's not seeing clearly, that's seeing through ideology. And so a prophet would be the person who would be able to sit there in society and say, these are the things that are going right, and these are the things that are going wrong. And that would be heterodox thought. They would not be speaking from within a political party. They would be speaking from a larger knowledge and truth. And in Judaism, we don't have prophets anymore. Why don't we have prophets anymore? Explicitly in the Talmud, we said that prophecy ended with Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Why was that? Because if a prophet comes and speaks the words of the Eternal, then you can change law. And we have this idea in Judaism, Lo b'shamayim hi, Torah is not in heaven, it's here. In other words, God gave us Torah to deal with it as we will, whether we're right or we're wrong. It's our responsibility, including our responsibility for fixing our messes. And the acknowledged problem with the prophet, well, we saw it. Just look up Shabbatai Tzvi if you've never studied this person. This was a false messiah, a false prophet who led to the deaths of huge amounts of Jews. One could say the same thing about Bar Kokhba by the end of the Roman-Jewish Wars. Literally half of the Jews on the face of this planet were dead. So yeah, we had reason to begin mistrusting what a prophet could do. And so we kind of left that person who could, through hearing a direct will of God, could then change our law behind, which leaves us with what? Dreams and Urim and Thumin? Well, what are dreams then? Okay, let me give it another analogy. Dreams are the things that help us get past our individual ego. So, all right, let's say we are someone who believes that we are completely healed and are completely above all the things that people do to us. And so we're constantly posting things like, here's how you understand an abuser. Here's how you understand a gaslighter. Well, as human beings, most all of us are hurting someone. Most all of us are trying to gaslight at some point or another. Why is that? Because we're human beings and that's what we do. And unless we're a saint or a tzaddik, none of us is elevated enough to be behind that. And so if we think that we are immune from doing those things, we are probably deceived. But where are we going to find out? How is God going to speak to us and tell us that we actually do the same things to others as we claim are only done to us? Well, we're probably going to have a dream about it. One of my favorite psychologists described dreams as a pre-conscious way that we are attempting to work out truths that we have not yet grasped. What an amazing way to look at that. Our pre-conscious also exists without our ideology. Our pre-conscious is not going to be worried about which candidate we voted for or what we thought we did when we caused someone to feel hurt the other day. Our unconsciousness is going to be a little bit more truthful and unfiltered. And so if we have that dream about us doing something that we can't imagine ourselves in our conscious mind doing, well, can we not perceive that as a way that God would speak with us? So prophecy would then be the ability for society at large to understand the greater truths of what's happening around us, whereas dream interpretation would be the way for us to understand how we are fooling ourselves. So what is the Urim and Thumin? Well, analogy number 3. How many of us at one point in our lives had said something like, all I want is to have free choice in my life decisions? Right? We've uttered that in some way or another. Guess what? You're lying. You're lying to yourself. I've lied to myself every time I've said that. The few times in my life that I've actually had a fairly equal decision, I did exactly what you did. You went and I went and talked to every single person we could to try to figure it out. We don't want equal potential decisions. They drive us absolutely crazy. We want a feeling of a hand moving us inexorably in one direction as opposed to the other. We don't like open and free decisions. We don't like feeling as though someone's imposing their will on us as well, which is one of the reasons that we have psychological issues and mental health issues, because we're constantly living in a flux of what we need versus what we think we need being somewhat different from each other. But we don't actually want that choice. And so when we have open and free choice, do I go left and do I go right? And both paths look pretty darn good. What do? We throw the dice. We flip the coin. This is actually something that's pretty well documented within cognitive behavioral therapy, working with people who've gone through addiction. So someone with gambling addiction, for example, might have that uncontrollable desire. I really need to go to the poker game, the slot machines, whatever. And you'll see people engaging in addictions that will flip a coin in their pocket. Okay, if it comes up heads, I'll go to the casino. If it comes up tails, I won't go to the casino. I've seen this as a pastoral counselor in multiple addictive areas. So this is something that we still do. Now, maybe if we don't want to externalize that via an object, we externalize it via our closest advisors, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what we're looking for is an external answer to an internal quandary. We don't know what's better, left or right, so we want to externalize that. Why? Because if we have an equal choice and I say, all right, I'm going to turn left, and things go really badly, I can't blame anyone but myself. And that's exactly what the Urim and the Thumin are. Making a choice that seems to be equal is one of the most terrifying things, because we cannot escape from ourselves when we make a decision based on our own tools, our logic, our thought. We really do want to externalize that. And so now as you read through the Tanakh, you're going to come across passage after passage that said something like, and so went and inquired of the Eternal, and the Eternal spoke to them and said, well, how that probably looks is Aaron went into the tent of meeting and said, all right, eternal presence of the universe, we are not sure if we need to go south or if we need to go east tomorrow. So if we need to go south, please show Urim. If you need to go north, please show Thumin. Flip the coin, roll the dice, whatever it is that allows us to give this binary sort of thing where there's also a possibility of an answer that is not clear. Remember the magic 8-ball? Wouldn't it be great if that's what went in the Urim and Thumin, was a tiny little magic 8-ball? And then the text says, and so Aaron inquired of the Eternal, and the Eternal said unto Aaron, yea, you shall take the left path. Because that's good, interesting, snappy writing is much more interesting than, and Aaron walked in and went, all right, thanks, God. And I'm not trying to cheapen our tradition. I'm trying to show how our tradition has wrestled with the exact same things that we continually wrestle with. So I promised in a sermon, I guess 2 weeks ago, that I would do this. I've been wanting to do this for a while. I find the Urim and the Thumin just incredibly fascinating, as I find that our tradition is so much bigger than we want it to be. We tend to only want to embrace a Judaism that we're comfortable with, but Judaism is massive and huge and delicious, and sometimes it has loose ends that are just disturbing, and jumping in and embracing those things, we're going to actually stop putting God in a box. That's why we're not supposed to make a graven image, because then it's about our ego. I can control God. Instead, we need to break out of that, and even considering God as something that can be encapsulated in any way, shape, or form. The Eternal, in this question of prophets and dreams and Urim and Thumin, the Eternal is the acknowledgement that we as human beings don't have the answers, and it drives us crazy when we don't. As individuals, as communities, we don't know what to do. We're all making it up as we go along, and if anyone comes up and says, I know exactly what to do, those are probably the people who you should run away as quickly as possible. The people who say, I've got a process by which I can try to get to the closest approximation of truth. And here's my methodology. My methodology is to embrace community, to have good advisors and good advice around me. And if I'm going to flip a coin to decide the fate of the universe, then I might want to admit that. Thank you, everyone, for being a part of Beit Virtuali. Let me know what you want to hear next. I've got a book coming out in just a few weeks at this point, so get ready. It'll be available on Amazon. A lot of these things I've talked about today are addressed in one way or another in the book. Thank you for allowing me the time to write, the time to do these sorts of videos. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Like and subscribe, and we will see you next time.
שיר חדש שירו לאדוני כל הארץ